like to welcome everyone to today's Bonar Institute webinar. It's wonderful that we have a small number of people because it makes it possible to have a discussion today of the ideas. And this is certainly not intended to be a presentation. It's simply to be an artifact for discussion, so to present some principles. I'm a true lifelong student of fiduciary duties and purposeful leadership. And in an era in which more and more stakeholders expect businesses to be responsible to a broader set of stakeholders in terms of fiduciary duties, I'm beginning to see a convergence between the principles of purposeful leadership and the heightened expectations of stakeholders for fiduciary duties for board members and corporate officers. So I'd like to start with the Bonar Institute's definition for purposeful leadership. And Elliot, you played a key role in helping to shape that definition. So it's wonderful you are here. Purposeful leadership is an ethical choice that principled leaders make to achieve something greater than themselves and the companies they lead. There is a lot behind that definition. The premise is very broad, and we can have a rich discussion about that. I'd like to go back a little bit in history about what is the origin of fiduciary duties. There is actually debate about when fiduciary duties began in history. There are notions of a fiduciary going back to the days of Roman law. There was a lot of fiduciary duty talk in the Catholic Church law and also trade guilds. But fiduciary duty law in terms of corporate governance really began in the 1600s with the Dutch East India Company. There are some people who claim that fiduciary duties in terms of board members actually began in England. I still believe it's more the Dutch East India Company. I can provide the sources I've relied on for this research. I'm happy to have a discussion. Even if the Dutch East India Company is not the ultimate origin, it played a very significant role. So first of all, the Dutch East India Company was innovative in terms of corporate governance. In 1602, it was the first limited liability company. So that meant that your investor's liability was limited to paid-in capital. And the reason that was innovative before the Dutch East India Company in the Kingdom of the Netherlands or Republic, I can't remember the name of the entity at the moment, at that period of time, there were many different trading companies, and an investor might invest all of their wealth in one expedition of a ship to the East Indies. And if the ship sank, that person's entire investment would be lost and they would become impoverished. So the innovation of the Dutch East India Company meant that individuals could invest and they could spread out their risk along with other investors, and some ships would be lost, but their liability would be limited, and then they would be able to sustain themselves despite the investment loss. And the corporation had a perpetual existence. During the period 1602 to 1799, it's the first known true board of directors in the sense of the separation of ownership and management. So that became an absolute necessity. The economist Adam Smith said, if you are an owner of a business, you need to be the manager of the business. But in Adam Smith's day, business was simpler. So you didn't have a lot of owners of businesses in general. But in this world in which You can have multiple investors. It was unwieldy to have many owners trying to have a say in management. So management started to become professionalized. And during that period, a Wallonian, and I do emphasize Wallonian because the political entities were different, Isaac Lemaire was the Dutch East India Company's largest shareholder, and he was a board member. And he began to self-deal against Dutch East India Company interest. VOC is the Dutch acronym for the Dutch name of the Dutch East India Company. So Isaac Lemaire really violated what we would call the duty of loyalty and the duty of good faith, because he literally invested in businesses that directly competed with the Dutch East India Company. So it actually became a necessary operating condition for business that there would be fiduciary duties. So scholars of corporate governance will say we have around 420 years of fiduciary duty or corporate governance doctrine law. So there's a very interesting book. And again, if you're interested, I can give that reference. So fiduciary duties, there actually are multiple expressions of them. In the United States, fiduciary duties are defined by state law. And there are three primary fiduciary duties: the duty of care and the duty of loyalty and the duty of good faith. Any individual state can create the substance, a unique definition and substance of each one of these duties. They can also create specific circumstances in which the duties differ. For example, in a merger or acquisition transaction, there might be a case by a judge that modifies how the duty of care or duty of loyalty is applied. So as I'm talking about what core fiduciary duties are, please remember that if you're interested in really understanding the fiduciary duties that apply to your business or your nonprofit organization, ultimately you'll need to consult state law. And some states even have separate fiduciary duty content or special circumstances for nonprofit organizations that are different from the fiduciary duties for for-profit corporations. And then fiduciary duty obligations can also differ by industry sector. So healthcare, for example, or financial services. So it is complex. There's also debate about whether the duty of good faith is a distinct fiduciary duty from the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. There are some jurisdictions that say the duty of good faith is inherently part of the duty of care and duty of loyalty, and it's just a useful vocabulary term to talk about specific obligations under the duties of care and loyalty. And other states have changed that, and they say, actually, there is a separate, distinct duty of good faith, and you can have litigation about violations of the duty of good faith, independent of violations of the duties of care and loyalty. Other fiduciary duties are the duty of oversight. The duty of oversight tends to be emphasized when you're in an industry sector where there's a compliance program. Healthcare organizations, for example, have a well-developed body of law and doctrine about the duty of oversight and compliance programs by the board of directors. The duty of obedience and the duty of disclosure that frequently come up in mergers and acquisitions, and when a board member or corporate officer might be invested in a business that is competing with another business that he or she is a board member of, and they need to disclose that potential conflict of interest. So there actually are other formulations of fiduciary duties if you go research in other jurisdictions. And certainly in privately held businesses, I would like to note partnerships, limited liability companies, limited liability partnerships. There are situations where you do not have a board of directors, and you might have an executive committee that behaves like a board of directors. And you can also contractually adjust fiduciary duties, or you can even adjust liabilities of fiduciary duties. So it's very complex, a lot of legal doctrine, but these are the 6 core fiduciary duties. I'd like to go a little deeper into what I call the most important fiduciary duties: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of good faith. And I'd like to ask you, as you're looking at these definitions, think about the definition of purposeful leadership, making an ethical decision to lead the companies and create value beyond just the mere profit motive, for example. So the duty of care requires board members and corporate officers to make decisions in the best long-term interests of the business. And I'd like to note that in doing so, board members must reconcile long-term and short-term interest of investors, owners, and the business. I would like to note, however, that the generation that we live in today, in fact, there are even articles that refer to the millennial corporation, that customers of today and other stakeholders in businesses, they would argue that there are stakeholders other than investors and owners, and the business itself that actually should come within the ambit of the duty of care. They don't under the law, but I would like to note that those stakeholders can ultimately influence the law. In addition to reconciling short-term and long-term interest of the business, the duty of care requires board members and officers to monitor business, financial, legal, and regulatory affairs. And board members have an obligation, and corporate officers, to be reasonably informed about business risks and opportunities. And you can think about artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is more of a risk. Artificial intelligence can be a huge opportunity and even an existential risk. So I would like to note that generally under most states' laws, it is possible for the corporate charter to exculpate directors from liability for violations of the duty of care. So Delaware law, for example, has such a provision. Now, the duty of loyalty is different. It's different also in terms of its legal consequences. I would like to note that whereas it is possible to exculpate board members for liability for violations of the duty of care, it is not possible to exculpate board members from liability for violations of the duty of loyalty. And therefore, in shareholder derivative suits against publicly held companies, the theory of liability is usually based on a violation of the duty of loyalty and the duty of good faith to overcome that exculpation from liability. So the duty of loyalty requires directors to disclose conflicts of interest in good faith, to not engage in prohibited self-dealing at the business's expense, to not usurp corporate opportunities, and to not commit fraud. And finally, the duty of good faith. And this case that I'm citing here, this is the Brehm v. Eisner case. It has an alternative name. It's called In Re Walt Disney Derivative Litigation. This is actually a very famous case. It's considered a landmark case in corporate governance law because it involved the hiring of a CEO, and the CEO was dismissed early, and he had a huge payout, and it became a very big dispute. But the case discussed in great detail what is good faith and bad faith for a corporate officer and a board member. And you'll notice the language. They refer to corporate fiduciaries. Corporate fiduciaries are officers and board members. And the good faith required of a corporate fiduciary includes not simply the duties of care and loyalty, but all actions required by a true faithfulness and devotion to the interest of the corporation and its shareholders. I'd like to pause a moment and ask us all to think about, go back to the definition of purposeful leadership, devotion to the interest of the corporation. When you think of that broader stakeholder group, this is where you begin to see how a director or corporate officer might consider other stakeholders beyond those required in the traditional fiduciary duty law. And here is another wonderful sentence I thought is important, a quote: a failure to act in good faith may be shown, for instance, where the fiduciary intentionally acts with a purpose other than that of advancing the best interest of the corporation, where the fiduciary acts with the intent to violate applicable positive law, or where the fiduciary intentionally fails to act in the face of a known duty to act, demonstrating a conscious disregard for his duties. Now, I'd like to just stop here a moment. The bar for asserting a claim against a director for a violation of the duty of good faith, the duty of care, or the duty of is very, very high. What I'd like to introduce as a thought today is that if you are a purposeful leader and you're engaging in all the behaviors of a purposeful leader, you almost inherently are going to do a very good job at fulfilling your fiduciary duties. And in fact, you're going to go beyond the textual requirements of fulfilling your duty of good faith. So I just want to introduce that thought as we're looking through the rest of the content here. Okay, so I'd like to go to the next slide. And I'd like to look at, and by the way, I see, Elliot, you've made a nice comment in the chat feature, and I love Leo Strine. Leo Strine is no longer on the Delaware court, and since he left the Delaware court, he's produced some beautiful scholarship. And you might be referring to some of his most recent articles in the Harvard Corporate Governance Forum. So I'm very aligned with what you're stating. So I'd like to focus now on the purposeful leader's attributes, and I'd like to position them as fiduciary superpowers, because I believe when you are a purposeful leader, you are an empowered fiduciary. So leaders are authentic, they're self-aware, and they have high levels of emotional intelligence and humility. Leaders have flexible and adaptable mindsets. Their leadership is based on values, integrity, ethics, and mindfulness. And I'd like to just pause for one moment. Values, integrity, ethics, and mindfulness. It's very, very interesting. I talk to a lot of attorneys, and they express frustration in understanding what ethics means in this context, because lawyers tend to think about liability for violations of the duty of care, loyalty, and good faith. And what is the relationship of ethics? And one of the things I like to mention, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General has released a lot of guidance for members of the boards of directors of healthcare organizations. And one of their obligations, if they want to receive credit against more onerous civil and criminal penalties under the federal sentencing guidelines, to the degree that those board members or the governing authority promote an ethical culture, and promote good values, the judge or the Department of Justice in the United States will actually give sentencing credit to the organization because the board of directors made a good faith effort to promote an ethical culture. So there is an intersection, and that's another area I would like to explore. So one of the things I have learned is that ethics is not well understood in the business world as a formal area of study, and it's something I'd like to explore further with boards. Another attribute of purposeful leadership is that leaders exercise sound judgment, control, and clarity. And the company vision is aligned with stakeholder values, and there's more of a focus on thinking long-term versus short-term. Now, I'd like to pause a minute about company vision aligned with stakeholder values. I actually believe there's a direct relationship between the broader community of stakeholders and the risk of litigation against corporations. So under traditional fiduciary duty law, your main stakeholders are the business itself and the investors, and then of course society in general. But there's not really attention paid to other stakeholders, like customers, for example. If there's a violation of product safety law, product liability law, advertising law, etc., that's where they might enter within the duty of care, or there's a cybersecurity breach. But what I would like to state is that when a company vision is aligned with stakeholder interest beyond the minimum expressed in laws, that the fiduciaries, the board members, and the corporate officers actually have a sort of superpower to anticipate where there's going to be difficulty. When stakeholders such as customers are upset, or society in general, that anger, that frustration that is not addressed by a business expresses itself in proposed legislation and class actions in the court system against the company that can actually harm the company's long-term interests. Might not harm the short-term interest, but it will harm the long-term interest of the company. And that is where I start to think of purposeful leadership being a fiduciary superpower, and it leads to greater emphasis on long-term consequences for the business. In fact, long-term in the sense that the long-term consideration might be longer than the tenure of the existing board's tenure, and the corporate officer's tenure as well, so into the next generation. Now, I'd like to also note that purposeful fiduciaries have a multi-stakeholder focus. Obviously, fiduciaries have to think about government and regulators. So when fiduciaries, board members, and corporate officers are protected by the business judgment rule. So they might, the business judgment rule means under fiduciary duty law, if a board member makes a decision that ultimately turns out to have a very negative result for the business or the shareholders, the legal system will presume that if that board made the decision in good faith, there's not going to be liability for the negative consequences of that decision. So what I'd like to note is when you are a fiduciary exercising the attributes of purposeful leadership, you're going to not eliminate the risk, but you will certainly reduce the risk of violating the law or making a stakeholder angry, such that the stakeholder is motivated to leverage the legal and regulatory system by requesting an administrative agency to initiate an investigation or commence a class action, or motivate the Department of Justice to initiate a civil or criminal investigation. Purposeful fiduciaries have the stakeholder focus on the community and society in general. We think about principles of sustainability in terms of climate change, the effect on the environment, safety. If you think about artificial intelligence, you're thinking about the job situation, the tax base of the community, et cetera. Your supply chain and your vendors. If you think about cybersecurity, recent cybersecurity cases against various businesses have shown that they have not been fully attentive to the interests, cybersecurity protection interests of other members of the supply chain and vendors. So recent cybersecurity breaches have uncovered very weak and poor cybersecurity practices. And the harm that was suffered was actually in members of the supply chain, the vendors, and also their customers. And amazingly, the business judgment rule has protected board members of those companies from having any liability, but the reputation of the business has been harmed, possibly for the long term. So even in a practical context of cybersecurity, a purposeful fiduciary versus a non-purposeful fiduciary. The purposeful fiduciary with that multi-stakeholder focus is probably going to care more about cybersecurity than someone who's focused on avoiding liability. Other board members in the C-suite should be part of the stakeholder focus. There actually is a doctrine in corporate governance law that when you have board members who have, let's say, more shares, majority shareholders, who are also board members versus board members who are minority shareholders. They actually have some duties to one another. So board members have to pay attention to one another as well. So being purposeful leadership, being purposeful leaders with leading with clarity and good judgment and high emotional intelligence and listening carefully to all stakeholders, promoting good relationships and sound decision-making on the board as a whole. Those purposeful fiduciaries are likely going to result in better decisions than non-purposeful fiduciaries. And then full-time employees and part-time employees would be part of the multi-stakeholder focus. I think about the recent strike in Hollywood by actors and writers who are threatened by the use of their likeness, by artificial intelligence creating images and videos of them, or being able to write scripts using the style of particular writers, therefore depriving them of a livelihood. Now, there's another doctrine that's emerging that I think converges with purposeful leadership. It has not changed the law, it has not changed the substantive law, but it has changed how litigation occurs in breach of fiduciary duty litigation. So the In re Caremark case is a landmark case in Delaware law, followed all over the United States. And it established basically oversight duties of the board. The Caremark case says essentially that boards must set up a system to monitor financial and non-financial risks and obligations. One of the ways they can show evidence of doing that is to create a compliance program. And the compliance program should take account of legal and regulatory obligations and industry standards. And the boards have to act in good faith to keep themselves reasonably informed about red flags. They have to make a good faith effort to exercise oversight over the program. A traditional Caremark case proceeds as follows. The board makes a decision. There might be a cybersecurity breach that causes a reduction in the share price. There might be violation of an industry standard, et cetera. The shareholders are harmed. They bring a lawsuit against the board as a whole and individual board members and corporate officers. Under Caremark claims, there are actually two types of Caremark claims that can be brought. And a Caremark case tries to establish either intentional bad acts or acts made in bad faith. And usually the Caremark case is dismissed on procedural grounds and nothing happens. And so they will allege the plaintiffs or the shareholders bringing the action are unable to establish a reasonable basis upon which a court might find that board members acted in bad faith and therefore are liable under breach of the duty of loyalty. What has changed is new cases that discuss what's called mission critical issues. So there are cases, the Martian v. Barnhill case, the In-Ray Clovis oncology case, and the Boeing case about the 747 MAX airplane, 737 MAX, excuse me. And what has happened in these cases is that the court has said, you know what, the risks that have been identified by the board are so great, they're mission critical for the business. The plaintiffs or the shareholders have met at least the initial burden of proof such that the case can proceed. So it's not stating that the shareholders have met the burden of proof for getting damages, but they've met the burden of proof to survive a motion to dismiss the case. And what is emerging as board best practices for boards to still retain protection of the business judgment rule is that the board has to proactively identify mission critical risks. Cybersecurity could be one of those. Also artificial intelligence. The board minutes must reflect regular discussion of the mission critical risks. The monitoring system, which is typically a compliance program or enterprise risk management system, must be adequate for identifying red flags, and that typically involves a very formal escalation process from the corporate officers. And another question that comes up is, do board members have enough subject matter expertise to recognize the mission critical risks? I find the In-Ray Clovis oncology case of particular interest because that was a case involving medical research, clinical trials, and risks regarding the clinical trials were not fully disclosed to the board. And but the board had a lot of medical expertise, but not sufficient regulatory expertise to understand the risks of getting FDA approval of a medical product that is that involves an approval process requiring clinical trials. A lot of interesting things going on. So under this mission critical theory, we're seeing heightened risk for board members and corporate officers. And indeed, I think it's worthy of discussion to talk about mission critical issues. For example, when a business says it is an AI first business, think about OpenAI, which owns ChatGPT. Is Microsoft, is Alphabet an AI first business? And what liability might be involved for the board members and corporate officers? And in cybersecurity, is it a strategy issue? Does it have strategic effects as a cybersecurity risk? Does that involve existential risks for the business, or is it still just an operational risk? There's actually a lot of debate in the cases. I'd like to note, I've already talked about the business judgment rule, but it's worthwhile thinking about it again. The business judgment rule is a judicial presumption that in making business decisions not involving direct self-interest, so the board members cannot violate the duty of loyalty, the board members cannot be self-dealing, and if the board members and the corporate officers have acted on an informed basis and in good faith and in an honest belief that their actions are in the corporation's best interest, then directors and officers are shielded from liability for unprofitable or harmful corporate transactions, as long as the transactions were made in good faith, with due care, and within the director's or officer's authority. And what I'd like to discuss is, if you are a purposeful leader, can you remove some of the harm to the business that has resulted? Can you prevent some of the bad decision making? And my belief is that yes, you can at least remove some of the harm by being a purposeful fiduciary, and you're leveraging fiduciary duty principles as a superpower in terms of a purposeful leader. I'd like to also note that being a purposeful fiduciary has many benefits. And think about businesses that you view as being excellent in terms of optimizing their leadership at the board level and corporate officer level. So you certainly optimize your legal and regulatory posture. So I noted that when the board promotes an ethical culture and has a robust compliance program and is really overseeing it, when there are violations of law or regulations, the United States Department of Justice will say, under the federal sentencing guidelines, we can reduce the penalties, civil and criminal, that we would otherwise assess, because your board is doing a good job in terms of trying to maintain an ethical culture with good values, and you're trying your best to train your employees on upholding the law. You also are likely to attract investors and customers. So we know that when a business or an underwriter is looking at a business in terms of an IPO or buying the business, they look at leadership. They assess leadership risk, and the Bonar Institute has programs to mitigate that leadership risk. And if you improve the leadership, you're more likely to attract investors. And think about it: if you are a customer of a business and you have a $10 million contract involved, you care a lot about the leadership of the company. You're more likely to optimize relations with the broader community of stakeholders. Individual board members, by being part of an optimized leadership team, are more likely to optimize their personal and professional reputation. And board members who are purposeful fiduciaries are more likely to attract the notice of board recruiters for other board careers. And finally, I believe that purposeful fiduciaries gain a deeper sense of purpose. So I've walked through some ideas, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I certainly would welcome any discussion. So Elliot, I'd like to go to your comment, but before I go to your comment, is there any discussion about the ideas that I presented so far?
I would just say that it's a very deep dive, but into U.S. law. Participating in a number of European forum on this, they basically say there's the world and then there's the U.S. Because what's happening with the courts in Canada and UK and Europe is that they're holding, and it's also the regulatory environment, holding companies and boards responsible to a much greater extent than in the U.S. Now, the one comment I made about Leo Strine, and Strine's not just writing, but there is a group of people, Strine included, who are trying to find a suit to bring before the courts of Delaware to challenge shareholder primacy. Strine believes that is a mischaracterization of court rule, and his view has been that Delaware corporate law is about the entire corporation. And the reason
Yes.
why shareholders have been predominant is they're the ones who've been bringing suit. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're trying, one of the thoughts is that unions would be able to have standing before the court on an
Mm-hmm.
issue, just trying to figure out the issue. And if they can do it, this is a consortium of a number of people, and some of them with quite a bit of money.
Mm-hmm.
It could have tremendous ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, Strine left the court and is, as you said, um, he really is trying to challenge the thinking of what's going on. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
back to purposeful, I think one of the until boards feel that there is that they are unprotected, it's going to be hard to push them to do things that are, hold on for
Mm-hmm. 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 So,
it's going to be, it's hard. I mean, look at the case of McDonald's. I mean, here was a board that knew
mm-hmm.
that the CEO was having multiple affairs within the company
Mm-hmm.
and claimed before the court that they didn't really know, and even if they had known, did it really impact their fiduciary responsibilities? And the court basically said, okay, they're not going to be held responsible, but the HR head is held responsible. When that has ramifications within the U.S. Boards, I find that there's I'm finding is that you're asking, particularly in the U.S., you're asking people to have a conscience and think purposefully, which is what we would all advocate for. But there's no pressure like there is in other countries to start thinking about supply chains, asking questions about employee rights, employee safety, because they know they're on the hook.
So Elliot, let's assume, and I am familiar because I worked for many European companies. So let's assume that indeed purposeful European boards are motivated to lead purposefully and consider a broad range of stakeholders, either through legal and regulatory mandates as well as culture and values. And let's assume that for Canada. And I'm going to assume that's the case. What has been the effect of that? Are European countries attracting more investment capital? Is capital more likely to flow there? Are customers, if there is a business in the US versus a purposefully led business in Canada or Europe that provides the same product or service, are the customers moving towards that? What's the practical effect of the better governance in other jurisdictions?
This is the core of the issue that I find troublesome, because we're asking a business case for morality.
Yeah.
And I keep going back to the case of before the Civil War, the South had a business case for slavery.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. So whenever I've stood before a board and they tell me, they ask the same question: is there a proof that this would work? Diversity, is there really a proof that it improves financials? I usually say to them, okay, would you argue that the South was right in a business case and that we should have protected the South's business case for this? There are a lot of reasons why capital doesn't flow in Europe. Part of it is risk aversion. Part of it is legislation, taxation. And so I think, the question is, are we advocates for purpose? Are we trying to make a business case And if we can't find a business case for it, we fail to kind of advocate it. Because no, I don't think you're going to find, I think you'll find that that companies with noted good workplace cultures tend to have better financial results. So we know there's something there. We know that I just had this discussion with somebody in the UK. If we can say very simply and say, doing the right thing is just doing smart marketing, meeting customer demand. Well, meeting customer demand and understanding customer demand is actually purposeful. Because the way businesses have operated is to develop the value and try to push it. And I think there is we're finding more and more attraction or distancing from the values of companies. We're seeing that particularly with younger employees that are choosing to work for companies or not work for companies, or buy from companies or not buy for companies. We're seeing some more investment moving toward sustainable companies and whatever. I mean, the biggest problem we have is that everything is politicized. So, but I think, I'm not sure if I think it's the right question to ask if the Canadian and European boards operate more on a principles versus rules basis. Can we show a monetary value accrues from that? I really am not sure if that's the right way to go. I guess the question is, if we believe in, why do we believe in purposeful leaders and purposeful boards? It's basically to create a more equitable world with more inclusivity. I mean, that's Mervyn King's comment, belief is we should be talking about inclusive capitalism or more equitable capitalism or whatever, which I agree with. And how do you measure that? We measure it basically by each stakeholder determining whether or not an organization has provided value to them. And the market will move in different ways. But the market conditions in Europe are so different than they are in the US. I mean, there is a group that is trying in Europe to get more venture capital money for the huge amount of biotech that's in particularly Germany. It's difficult because Germans are so risk adverse. They have to be 100% right. We have to be 51% right. That's a quote from an anthropologist, C.T. Hall, about the difference between Germans and Americans. So yeah, I think there are a lot of differences. The other thing is that I think we need to find companies and celebrate their incremental steps. No one's going to change overnight. It's going to be incremental. They have to be proven that it's different. It moves, and that's why I think it's the NACD activity and their questions around purpose. My view was you can't basically say to a company, become more purposeful and expect them to round the edges. Each director has to learn what that means. And it's not going to be easy because each director is going to be fighting against the rest of the board. And boards are going to have a proclivity in the near term to not bring on to the board people who will challenge them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be a slow process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. James, any thoughts?
I find the conversation really fascinating. Elliot, I think what you're saying about the slow process is absolutely true. I think of what you also mentioned about making, if I get it wrong, please correct me, but trying to make the business case when it's not really a business case, we're speaking about it's a moral issue. I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I know that at the Institute, we believe that we can measure the financial success of an organization with regard to purposeful leadership. That is a belief that we believe that we have some statistics to back us up, whether or not there are enough statistics backing us up to make it a compelling argument. I'm not sure yet. As a matter of fact, I don't think it is quite there. But I think that the indications are that when people do create a high performance culture with the pillars of psychological safety and trust, many of those organizations do tend to be more productive and have better financial returns than those that do not. But is it a slam dunk? No, I don't think it is.
And I think, I just shared Alex Edmonds' video on LinkedIn, because what Alex is saying is, and I completely agree, we have been living for the last 30 years in a value extraction mindset, that the only way to grow profits is to take them out of the market for individuals or whatever, versus a value creation mindset. And that is more purposeful. One of the things is to change from a value extraction to a value creation. What that means to a board is that shareholders are extractors. Shareholders contribute no value, really. They give you $1,000, and unless employees and customers put it to work, there's $1,000 left. They extract value, and they got the residual value after everyone else. And I think that until we can get companies to recognize that the way to shareholder value is through value creation for employees and customers, if we can get that, we get them more purposeful. I mean, that is a big step that is slowly starting to happen with some companies.
Yes.
We've seen with a couple of the bank failures, not just in the US, but also in Credit Suisse.
Yes.
That this mindset of staying within a little cocoon is not going to be a long-term solution. But you need more of that. You need not just the failures, but you need more successes to show it.
Well, I would like to mention something that I mentioned in the presentation part that I think needs more emphasis, and I need to do more research to illustrate it, but I actually do have a practical illustration. So I mentioned that a purposeful fiduciary, so that would be a board member and corporate officer, and as a whole organization having the attributes of purposeful leadership, there is an expense, just pure money, that has to be allocated for defense of class action lawsuits, civil and criminal investigations by the United States Department of Justice, state attorneys general, etc. So what has happened in healthcare, and I believe there are other examples, but in healthcare, medical malpractice liability from medical error is obviously a huge problem, and it's probably going to increase with the increased use of artificial intelligence.
Right.
But one of the things, and it's been a big debate, there were some progressive healthcare systems who said, let's have the physician and the hospital apologize. When we amputated 2 legs instead of 1, or we amputated the wrong leg and then had to go back and amputate the right leg, let's apologize instead of waiting for the patient's family to file a lawsuit. And there was of course, I'm using an exaggerated example, but those unfortunately are real examples. Those situations have happened. And hospitals found that they were able to reduce the number of medical malpractice lawsuits just by acknowledging medical error. And then they were able to better predict their litigation expense. So it kind of gets into ethics, compliance, and law, but it's kind of what I'd call preventive law. It's definitely an attribute of purposeful leadership. It requires active board oversight. It's a small example, but I think it's an example. And when I think of, there's, and I don't know all the circumstances, but Philips in the Netherlands has sleep apnea machines that have a defect, allegedly causing illness. I don't fully understand, but mold spores, I think. And Philips' reputation is suffering, although I don't think it's going to harm their business because they're such a large business. But, it's Philips, what Philips does in response to that. I look at Toyota and Hyundai. There have been examples, there's been examples of bad behavior by the companies, but there have been examples of good behaviors by the companies when there were product defects. And those companies were very proactive in addressing customer problems. That's an example of what I would call being a purposeful fiduciary. You're acting on a moral and ethical basis, but there's actually a financial benefit. It might not be extra profit, but it's on the long term, it's reducing your litigation expense. It's enhancing your reputation. You're reducing your investigation exposure and penalty exposure from a compliance perspective. And so to me, there is some kind of business case that can be made.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right on that. I mean, there is tons of data that have shown that companies that have, for example, a good reputation for being a good place to work, hire and retain employees at a lower overall cost.
Yes.
Now, I always have to watch it because when I say lower, people go, "Oh, that means they're paying." Well, they are paying. I mean, when I was at DuPont, we were very, very clear. We did not try to be the highest paid company in the chemical industry, because what we said was the reputation, the affinity that employees have, the benefits that they get, the background, is worth a lot. And the companies that have to struggle to give employees pay more. The same thing with litigation, the same thing with regulatory compliance. And so I think we can take it from a standpoint of, from a reputational value standpoint, that there is clear evidence.
Yes.
And what the purpose of my book was to basically take it to a business case instead of a PR and marketing case, is to say, the way to build value is to understand your stakeholders and build value that way. And that it is a competitive advantage to you to be more reputable than your other competitors, because it benefits you financially and limits them and increases cost for your competitors to acquire your employees, to acquire your customers and whatever. That's, to me, that's captured under purposefulness. I mean, it's sort of start with the whole concept of, the purpose of a company is to ask itself, why does it exist, and what's the value it brings? And, we've had this discussion, and I think, John, you've been very clear about some, you'll ask some of the people and they'll go, the purpose of corporations is make a profit. Go, okay, tell me how you do it. Then you get into an interesting discussion of, who are you serving? And you can serve your shareholders, but company after company that has taken a short-term view of shareholder primacy have run into more problems financially than companies have taken a longer-term view. I mean, I'm delighted that Johnson & Johnson seems to be moving back toward their credo and away from about 10 to 12 years of CEOs and boards that didn't put as much emphasis on it. They're now, and they're getting celebrated for it now. And I've had this discussion with J&J. It's going to be a longer term push. They used to be the number one place people wanted to work in the pharmaceutical industry. They've dropped now, and it's because of the history. Also, they're a bigger, older company. People like to work for smaller. I've seen that in other companies, but that I think, we have some evidence of companies that are distancing themselves and can ask, why does a company do better than another company in a given industry? And we can some of the measures there. Hold on for a minute.
Well, we've actually reached the end of our hour, but I'll wait on Elliot before I end our webinar. So, James, any other thoughts based on the comments we've just heard?
It's a good conversation. I think what we also note is that when we're talking in terms of purposeful leadership, purposeful boards, purposeful corporations, it is the transition from shareholder mentality to much more of a stakeholder mentality, as you both have been describing. And that is a very important one. But I see Elliot is back, so
yeah, that's I have to go. But John, it's the level of knowledge of you that you have in terms of fiduciary responsibility is extremely deep and very impressive. And I think that my only comment is that if this were a group of a bunch of Europeans, they would probably say, you're talking about things that are purely US. We're getting pressure in different ways, and it's mainly the nature of societies, which are more collective versus individualistic, and their regulatory environments are changing. They're worrying about their supply chains in ways that we haven't had to worry about it. They're getting taken to court on greenwashing, which we haven't yet been having to worry about. So, as who was it at the at Rotman School of Business, University of Toronto said, Canada's about 10 years behind Europe, and US is about 15 years behind Europe in terms of thinking about stakeholders.
Well, it's interesting.
I don't know if it's that bad, but it's different.
Well, one thing I'd like to just note, when I talk to European entrepreneurs, they say, we want to exit Europe and move to the United States. That's what I hear. And
let our politics change and see what happens.
Yeah, it will be interesting. It will be interesting. Well, thank you, everyone.